When my son looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, you're just baggage now," I smiled and nodded like the helpless old man he thought I was. What he didn't know was that I still held 25% of the company and full veto rights on the board. 3 months later, I walked into that emergency meeting, picked up a pen, and signed the document that stripped him of everything he thought he'd taken from me. His face went white as the paper slid across the table. That frozen expression was worth every sacrifice I'd made building what he'd tried to throw away. But that signature was just the beginning of what I had planned. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Just before you continue to watch, Joe would like you to subscribe to this channel and like this video. It would encourage him to keep his streak of thrilling revenge stories for you to watch. All right, back to the story. It was after our quarterly review when Daniel looked me in the eye and said those words that would change everything between us forever. "Dad, you're just baggage now." The conference room went silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning above our heads. I laughed at first because surely my only son was making some kind of inappropriate joke at my expense. But when I looked at his face, I saw nothing but cold calculation staring back at me from features that resembled my own. Around us, the younger executives Daniel had hired shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, their eyes finding sudden interest in their laptop screens and coffee cups. That night, I sat alone in my car outside the office building, staring at the glowing sign that still bore my name in letters I'd paid for myself 20 years ago. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and I realized that the boy I'd raised had become someone I no longer recognized. Walking through the office the next morning felt like trespassing in a place that used to feel like home to me. The new decor was sleek and impersonal, with glass walls and modern art that meant nothing to anyone who worked there. Daniel had replaced half the old team with his so-called modern thinkers, young professionals who spoke in buzzwords and had never loaded a single truck themselves. My old colleagues, the ones who'd been with me since we operated out of a rented warehouse, barely made eye contact anymore when I passed them in the hallways. Loyalty, it seemed, had an expiration date, just like the contracts we signed with our shipping partners every year. Marcus, who'd worked for me for 15 years, actually looked away when I said good morning to him in the break room. The company culture I'd built on respect and hard work had been replaced by something cold and competitive. I could feel it in every interaction, every forced smile. Where my office used to be was now something called a wellness lounge, complete with yoga mats and a juice bar. A young intern with a name tag that read Brittany approached me with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes at all. "Mr. Fenn, this space is for collaborative resets and mindfulness breaks," she explained, gesturing toward the beanbag chairs where my desk used to sit. I smiled politely and thanked her for the information, but inside I felt completely hollow and displaced from my own creation. The nameplate that once read Jacob Fenn, founder and CEO, had been dumped in a storage closet along with boxes of old files. I found it there later that afternoon, covered in dust and forgotten like I was supposed to be forgotten too. My wife's photo, which had sat on my desk for 20 years, was in that same box. That's when I decided that if they wanted me gone from this place, I would leave them something they couldn't erase or throw away. When I handed Daniel majority control 3 years ago, I'd kept exactly 25% of the company's shares for myself. It was just enough to stay on the board of directors and have a voice in major decisions that affected the company's future. He never bothered to check the fine print in the shareholder agreement his lawyers had drawn up at my insistence back then. Every month since then, I quietly attended board meetings in the back corner of the room, listening as he boasted about his vision for expansion. I stayed silent through his presentations, nodding occasionally and pretending to be the confused old man who didn't understand the new world of logistics. The other board members seemed to forget I was even there most of the time, which suited my purposes perfectly well. I took notes in my small leather journal, documenting every decision and every dismissive comment Daniel made about the old ways. Silence, I was learning, can be the loudest and most powerful weapon of all when used correctly and patiently. Daniel launched an ambitious expansion into tech logistics, a flashy new division that bled money faster than it generated any real revenue. He ignored all the warnings from the financial advisors, including mine, waving them away with the confidence of someone who'd never failed before. "You're stuck in the past, Dad," he told me during one particularly tense board meeting where I questioned the spending. "This is how the future of shipping works, and you just don't understand it anymore." I watched as his pride ballooned into dangerous arrogance that reminded me of young men I'd seen crash and burn in business before. The new division required massive infrastructure investments, expensive software that barely worked, and consultants who charged outrageous fees for advice that went nowhere. But when the quarterly losses started hitting harder than projected, the other board members started whispering concerns to each other during breaks. Those whispers, I noticed with growing interest, started finding their way back to me during phone calls and private lunches downtown. Daniel invited me to dinner at an expensive steakhouse downtown, his first real gesture toward me in several months of silence. Over perfectly cooked ribeye and expensive wine that I knew the company was paying for, he smiled too much and made small talk about nothing. "Dad, maybe it's time you considered retiring fully from the board," he finally said, setting down his fork with careful precision. He wanted my remaining 25% of shares, calling it symbolic closure and a chance for me to enjoy my golden years without stress. I looked across the table at him and saw the same raw ambition I'd once possessed when building the company from nothing decades ago. But where my ambition had been tempered by love for the work and respect for people, his was hollow and self-serving in ways that worried me. I told him I would think about his proposal seriously and get back to him within a few weeks. That night, after he dropped me at my house, I immediately called my lawyer and longtime friend Theodore Haynes. Theodore Haynes had been with me since the company's very first major contract back when we were nobody in the industry. When I explained what Daniel was asking for during our meeting in his downtown office, Theodore actually chuckled and shook his head knowingly. "You taught that boy everything about business, Jacob," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Everything except where the real power actually sits in a company structure like yours." He pulled out the original shareholder agreement from his filing cabinet, the one we drafted so carefully 3 years before. His finger traced a specific clause that I'd almost forgotten about in my grief and exhaustion. "You still have veto rights on major financial decisions and executive appointments, Jacob," he reminded me with a slight smile. It felt like someone had just lit a match in a room that had been completely dark for months and months. I realized then that I didn't need to fight Daniel directly or argue with him at board meetings anymore. I just needed to step back carefully and let him destroy himself with his own arrogance and poor decisions. Over the next several weeks, I watched from my quiet corner of the boardroom as Daniel's tech expansion project continued sinking deeper into red ink. He doubled down on his strategy, signing even riskier contracts with unproven partners and hiring more expensive consultants who spoke in jargon nobody understood. Every single time he dismissed my questions or concerns with a patronizing wave of his hand, I noticed the other board members growing more uneasy. They would glance at each other with worried expressions when Daniel presented his latest spending proposals to the group. The company's traditional shipping division, the foundation I'd built brick by brick, was being starved of resources to fund his vanity project. Longtime clients were complaining about service delays and communication problems that never existed under my leadership years before. Daniel didn't see any of it because he was too focused on impressing tech industry publications with his innovation talk. His empire was developing cracks that would soon become canyons, and everyone could see it except him and his loyal young followers. Daniel burst into my house late one evening without calling first, his face flushed red with anger and something close to panic. "Did you know about this audit the board called for?" he demanded, standing in my doorway like an accusing prosecutor. I calmly invited him inside and poured him tea from the pot I'd just made, taking my time with each careful motion. "I heard something about it in passing at the last meeting," I said quietly, sitting down across from him at my kitchen table. He paced back and forth across my worn carpet, muttering accusations that someone on the board was deliberately sabotaging him and his vision for the company. His hands shook slightly as he ran them through his hair repeatedly, a nervous gesture he'd had since childhood when stressed. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that I had actually voted in favor of that comprehensive financial audit myself. He stormed out 20 minutes later without finishing his tea, slamming my front door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. The very next morning, he called an emergency board meeting, and that's when I finally saw genuine fear replacing the arrogance in his eyes. The auditors presented their preliminary findings to a completely silent boardroom that felt heavy with tension and unspoken accusations. They'd discovered inflated contracts with vendor companies that had questionable credentials, mismanaged expense accounts that couldn't be properly justified, and several unapproved partnership agreements that violated our corporate governance policies. Daniel tried desperately to talk his way out of each finding, blaming communication errors and accounting misunderstandings that anyone could make. His voice grew louder and more defensive with each explanation he offered to the increasingly skeptical board members around the table. But the numbers didn't lie, and the documentation was thorough and damning in its detail about wasteful spending and poor oversight. The board members kept glancing toward me in my corner seat, as if waiting for some signal or guidance from the founder. I simply asked one clear question that cut through all of Daniel's excuses and justifications. Where's the accountability for these decisions and outcomes? Complete silence filled the room after my words, broken only by someone's uncomfortable cough. That's when the board chairman, a respected industry veteran, quietly suggested that Daniel be placed on temporary suspension pending the completion of the full audit review process. Daniel cornered me in the narrow hallway outside the boardroom immediately after that devastating meeting ended and people scattered quickly. "You think this company actually needs you anymore? You're just baggage, old man," he hissed, his voice cracking with emotion despite his angry words. His face was pale except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheeks, and I could see his hands trembling at his sides. The wounded pride in his voice was almost painful to hear, because I remembered when he'd looked up to me with genuine admiration. But his arrogance wouldn't let him stop talking, wouldn't let him admit that maybe he'd made serious mistakes that needed correcting. I looked at him carefully, really studied his face, and saw the scared boy hiding behind all that defensive anger and bravado. He was terrified of failing, of being exposed as someone who wasn't ready for the responsibility he'd demanded so insistently. "You'll understand everything soon enough, son," I told him quietly, then turned and walked away down that long hallway. I could feel his eyes burning into my back with every step I took toward the elevator and freedom. Rumors began spreading rapidly through the industry that Daniel had misused company funds for personal trips and expensive lifestyle purchases beyond his salary. Whether these specific accusations were entirely true or partially exaggerated didn't matter much in the court of public opinion and business relationships. Perception, as I'd learned over 30 years in logistics, is absolutely everything when it comes to trust and partnerships in our field. His former allies and supporters started carefully distancing themselves from him, returning his calls hours later instead of immediately like they used to. The young executives who'd laughed at his jokes and praised his innovation suddenly found reasons to be too busy for lunch meetings. My phone, which had been relatively quiet for months, suddenly started ringing again with familiar voices from the past asking careful questions. Old partners and clients wanted my opinion on the company's direction, my guidance on whether their contracts were still secure, and my reassurance about stability. They wanted to hear from someone who'd never let them down in 20 years of doing business together. The board scheduled another vote for the following week to determine Daniel's immediate future with the company he thought he controlled completely. We gathered in that same conference room where Daniel had once confidently told me I was irrelevant to the company's future success. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as the board chairman distributed the official ballot papers to each member. When all the votes were carefully counted and verified by our corporate attorney, the decision was completely unanimous without a single dissenting voice. Daniel was to be immediately removed as acting CEO pending the completion of the full investigation into financial irregularities and management practices. The color drained from Daniel's face until he looked almost gray under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no actual words came out as he processed what was happening to his career. The other board members couldn't meet his eyes as they quietly gathered their papers and prepared to leave the uncomfortable meeting. Then the chairman slowly slid a formal document across the polished table directly toward me, the paper making a soft sliding sound in the silence. It was the official removal order that required my signature as the founding shareholder to make everything legally binding and permanent. I picked up the expensive pen slowly, feeling the weight of 30 years of history and 3 years of disappointment pressing down on my shoulders. For just a moment, I allowed myself to think about Daniel's mother and how incredibly proud she would have been if he'd chosen a different path. She died believing our son would carry on the legacy we'd built together with love and sacrifice for our family. He whispered just one word across the table, his voice breaking with emotion. "Dad, please." But the young man who'd called me baggage so casually and dismissed everything I'd taught him had made his choice long ago. He'd chosen ego over humility, shortcuts over integrity, and power over family bonds that should have mattered most. My hand moved steadily across the paper without trembling as I signed my full name in the spaces provided. The scratching sound of pen on paper seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room as I sealed his fate. When I finally looked up after finishing the signature, Daniel's eyes were wet with tears he was desperately trying to hold back. The conference room remained absolutely silent, except for the deliberate scratching of my pen, completing the required signature lines on multiple copies. Daniel just stood there frozen in place beside his chair, complete disbelief written clearly across every feature of his face. The realization was dawning on him, far too late to matter now, that I'd been holding the real power all along, despite his arrogance. When I slid the completed document back across the table to the chairman, Daniel couldn't even look directly at me anymore. His eyes were fixed on the paper like it was a death sentence, which, in many ways, it was for the career he'd imagined. The other board members began quietly gathering their belongings, eager to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere of a family tragedy playing out in corporate form. I stood up slowly, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the door without looking back at my son standing there defeated. But as I reached the hallway, I knew deep down that the real reckoning between us hadn't even truly begun yet. This was just the first consequence of his choices, not the final resolution of our broken relationship. Daniel's removal made headlines in every local business publication and industry newsletter within 24 hours of the board meeting. The articles called it a dramatic generational shift in leadership at Fen Logistics, which was deeply ironic considering the actual truth behind the change. Reporters who'd praised Daniel's innovative vision just months earlier now wrote analytical pieces questioning his judgment and management experience critically. Current employees started reaching out to me through emails and phone calls, many of them apologizing sincerely for how they'd treated me recently. They'd sensed which way the wind was blowing and wanted to realign themselves with the founder who still commanded respect in the industry. I didn't hold grudges against most of them because they'd just been following their boss and trying to keep their jobs secure. But I didn't forget who'd actively participated in pushing me aside and who'd simply stayed silent to protect themselves. A week after the removal, I received an unexpected visitor at my home late one evening. It was Daniel's wife, Amanda, and she looked completely exhausted with smudged makeup and red-rimmed eyes from obvious crying. Amanda stood on my doorstep, wringing her hands nervously, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd hosted company parties at their expensive house. "Jacob, please, you have to understand that he's completely falling apart," she pleaded, her voice thick with desperation and genuine fear. Part of me felt immediate pity for her situation, because she'd always treated me with basic respect, even when Daniel hadn't. But pity alone doesn't rebuild broken trust or undo the damage that's been done to relationships and businesses over years of poor choices. I invited her inside and made her sit down at my kitchen table, the same place where I'd served her family dinners before everything fell apart. "Amanda, he has to learn what real loss feels like before he can understand what he's thrown away," I told her softly but firmly. She nodded slowly while crying quietly into a tissue she'd pulled from her purse, mascara making dark tracks down her pale cheeks. "He already is learning, Jacob. He sits in the dark for hours and won't talk to anyone anymore," she whispered. Then she reached into her bag and handed me something that surprised me completely. It was Daniel's formal resignation letter from the company board. The resignation letter was brief and formal, stripped of all the confidence and bravado that usually characterized Daniel's communication style at work. He wanted to sell his majority shares back to the company immediately for exactly half their current market value to generate quick cash. His personal accounts were frozen pending the investigation's completion, and he desperately needed money to maintain his lifestyle and legal defense fund. The offer was financially foolish on his part, the kind of panicked decision that a better businessman would never make under pressure. I could have accepted immediately and regained control of my company at a bargain price that any investor would celebrate as brilliant. But after reading his words carefully several times, I chose a completely different path that surprised even myself in the moment. I wrote back on my personal stationery in my own handwriting rather than typing a cold business response. "Keep your shares, Daniel. Maybe you'll eventually learn what they actually cost to earn in the first place." 1 week later, I found him waiting for me at the old truck yard where this entire company had first begun decades ago. Daniel stood beside my very first delivery truck, the rusted Ford that I'd never been able to bring myself to sell despite its condition. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt where I'd once parked 6 trucks and thought I was building an empire. "I finally get it now, Dad," he said without looking at me, his voice breaking with emotion. "You built something real here, something that mattered beyond just making money." His hand rested on the truck's faded hood like he was touching a piece of history he'd never bothered to understand before now. I didn't answer right away because words felt inadequate for this moment between a father and son surrounded by ghosts of our shared past. Instead, I walked over and patted the truck's hood beside his hand, feeling the warm metal beneath my palm. We stood there together in complete silence for what felt like a long time, just breathing and existing in the same space. The sounds of the city continued around us, but in that moment we were isolated in our own world of regret and possibility. I knew then that forgiveness, real forgiveness, would require much more than a single apology or moment of understanding between us. Several months after Daniel's removal, the board of directors formally offered me the interim CEO position until they could conduct a proper search. The offer came with a significant salary increase and full authority to restructure the company however I saw fit for maximum stability. I looked at the contract they'd prepared, with my name already typed in the signature line, waiting for my acceptance. Then I refused their generous offer, clearly and definitively, which shocked everyone in that meeting who'd expected me to jump at the opportunity. Let the company find someone new and qualified who isn't carrying 30 years of baggage and family complications, I explained calmly. What I wanted now was peace in my remaining years, not the power and stress that came with running a company this size. The board eventually hired a respected industry veteran who had no connection to the Fenn family and brought fresh perspective without our drama. Still, Daniel's very public downfall had left a permanent mark on the company's reputation and taught harsh lessons to everyone involved. Then a local business reporter asked me a pointed question during an interview that I hadn't expected at all. The journalist was young and sharp-eyed. the kind who sensed there was more to this story than the official corporate statements suggested. "Mr. Fenn, do you personally regret signing that removal order against your own son?" she asked directly, her recorder running between us. I paused for a long moment, genuinely considering my answer, rather than giving an automatic response designed to sound good in print. Did I regret it? Perhaps I regretted how our relationship had deteriorated to the point where such an action became necessary for everyone involved. But I couldn't honestly say I regretted protecting what I'd built, or holding him accountable for serious mistakes that affected many people's livelihoods. I regret not teaching him earlier that legacy isn't about control or power over others, I answered carefully, choosing each word deliberately. It's about responsibility, integrity, and understanding that everything you build stands on the shoulders of those who came before you. The interview was published 2 days later and went unexpectedly viral on business social media platforms within hours. Daniel apparently saw the article and reached out to me again through a handwritten letter that arrived in my mailbox the following week. His letter arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, the handwriting shaky and uncertain in a way I'd never seen from him before. "Dad, I understand now what I couldn't see through my arrogance and pride," he wrote across 2 full pages of personal stationery. "You weren't holding me back from success like I told myself repeatedly. I was actively pushing you away because accepting your guidance meant admitting I didn't have all the answers. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt something genuinely close to closure settling in my chest." He explained that he was starting completely fresh on his own, without the family name or connections, just his skills and hard-learned lessons. There was no business empire this time, no fancy office or impressive title to hide behind when things got difficult. Just Daniel trying to rebuild his career and reputation from the ground up, the way I'd done 40 years earlier. He'd secured a small local logistics contract, handling deliveries for medical supply companies. Honest work that required actual effort and attention to detail. Reading his words carefully, I decided that maybe it was finally time to see him again face to face. One last meeting to determine if reconciliation was truly possible. We met at a small diner downtown, the same place where I used to grab coffee before dawn shifts back when the company was young. Daniel had lost noticeable weight since I'd last seen him up close, and his face looked older with new lines around his eyes. But there was something different in his expression now, a clarity that had been missing during his years of arrogant success at my company. I secured a small logistics contract handling medical supplies for 3 clinics, he told me quietly over coffee that had grown cold. I'm trying to earn everything the right way this time, doing the actual work myself instead of just managing from an office. I smiled slightly despite myself, because now he sounded exactly like his old man when I was building something real from nothing. We sat there sharing that cold coffee in comfortable silence for a while. No boardrooms or egos or corporate politics between us anymore. Just a father and son trying to find their way back to each other across a divide that had seemed impossible to cross. Then he looked up from his cup and asked me something that made me pause mid-breath. Daniel's eyes met mine directly for the first time in what felt like years of avoiding real connection between us. "Dad, do you honestly think you could ever trust me again after everything I've done?" he asked simply, his voice carrying genuine vulnerability. It was such a straightforward question, but the honest answer was incredibly complicated after years of disappointment and betrayal between parent and child. I thought carefully about my response before speaking because I didn't want to give him false hope or crushing rejection in this fragile moment. "Trust isn't something that's given freely anymore at my age, Daniel," I told him quietly. "It's rebuilt slowly through consistent actions and demonstrated change over time, not just words or promises." He nodded slowly, understanding the truth of what I was saying, even though it wasn't the immediate forgiveness he might have hoped for. His eyes grew wet with tears he didn't try to hide from me anymore. "Then I'll start rebuilding it today and every day after until you believe me again," he said with quiet determination. Sitting there looking at him, I realized that maybe revenge and justice had finally given way to something more valuable. Perhaps redemption was possible after all. Several months passed before I visited Daniel's new office, a small converted warehouse space that reminded me powerfully of my own humble beginnings. The place was cluttered but alive with genuine purpose and honest work happening in every corner I could see around me. He'd named his modest new company Fen & Son Logistics, and this time my name wasn't just empty decoration or stolen legacy. It represented gratitude, respect, and the acknowledgement of lessons finally learned through painful experience rather than dismissed advice from an old man. When I walked through the door that afternoon, Daniel turned from a conversation with one of his drivers and saw me standing there. His face broke into a shy smile, uncertain but hopeful about my presence in his workspace and life. "I saved you a seat over here, Dad," he said quietly, gesturing toward a simple desk positioned near his own in the corner. For the first time in years since this nightmare began, I sat down beside my son without resentment or disappointment weighing on my shoulders. I wasn't sitting there as baggage to be discarded when convenient, but as a father who'd finally taught his son the most important lesson. Legacy means nothing without the character to carry it forward with honor and humility toward those who built it first. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, comment, and smash the subscribe button. Also, check out other videos on the channel. Joe's got more interesting stories for you.